education, which we call in economics human capital, is probably the most important asset that individuals bring for their life in general, certainly for their potential income as earners and workers and support of their family. So therefore, the role of education in life has been growing in the last 150 years. And I think it will be as important and more important in the coming years because innovations and new methods, etc., make our world much more complicated. And without high quality education of understanding and being able to learn new things, it's not the education. The most important part of education is to teach you how to teach yourself.
Welcome everybody to our podcast, The Future Economist. Our podcast is about education and economics education in particular. I'm delighted to have with us today Professor Zvi Eckstein, Dean of Tiomkin School of Economics at Reichman University, and the head and founder of Aaron Institute for Economic Policy. Hi, Zvika.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So it's really wonderful to have you with us. As I always start my podcast, I always ask our guests to tell us a little bit about yourself, how you became an economist.
Well, I grew up in a kibbutz, and I think I was lucky that in our year before completing high school in the kibbutz, we had a professor, a teacher, that actually studied Dan Patenkin introductory book, and he taught us about the opportunity curve and how you trade off between different products like bread and guns, and got me excited that you can discuss economic issues using models and the graphs. And then after completing the 3-year army, I decided I want to study economics, and there it goes. I enjoyed it, and since then I really love every aspect of economics that I have studied so far.
And you studied so much. So tell us a little bit about also the path. One of the things we're interested in this podcast is to explain to the listeners the path of an economist. I must say, economist is not a profession that has very big PR. So
no, we studied. I started study at Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is considered a good school, and I liked living in Ramat Gan, where actually my parents who left the kibbutz lived in Ramat Gan. So I stayed with them, and I stopped, and I really enjoyed economics, introductory economics. I worked very hard, and in the second year and the third year, I really become very excited about research. Then I took a first job as a transportation economist in a consulting firm, and I even enjoyed it more. Then I started my master's, and I enjoyed very much masters. I had excellent teachers, and the most exciting teachers that I had were Professor Asaf Razin, and Professor Elchanan Helpman. And then after the Yom Kippur War, I thought I would like to do a PhD. I looked around and I looked at all the professors around, Alex Kuckerman and Fisher Zone and so forth, and I enjoyed a lot what issues they are dealing with and what they are doing. And in fact, Professor Razin offered me to go to the University of Minnesota because there were, for him, a few leading economists who are really doing a revolution in economics, in macro in particular, Professor Sargent, Professor Neil Wallace, and Professor Christopher Sims. And he recommended that I would study a lot going to Minnesota. And actually, the two out of the three I mentioned, that the Asaf mentioned them as stars in the late 70s, got their Nobels in 2011. And they were actually, Sargent and Chris were actually my thesis advisors. And Minnesota was an excellent place of revolutionizing macroeconomics, but not only macroeconomics, also some micro and development. My main advisor was Ann Kruger, who became later a leading economist at the World Bank, at the IMF, and she was a leading economist in particular on development countries. And I did my dissertation on the Egyptian economy. And that was kind of unique to use the new method of econometrics and rational expectation into development economics. And that led me to a career at Yale University and then at Tel Aviv and so forth. And I continued learning new fields that were derived a lot from the background I got in Minnesota at the 4 years from 1976 to 1980.
When you say they were revolutionary, what was the revolution back then? What was the new thing?
The key revolution, if you look at retrospect, was both in methods and economic modeling. And the key in their idea is that people live in a dynamic stochastic environment in uncertainty, and they form their expectations based on what they have seen in the past. And that these expectations generate a very important factor in how they make decisions. The first application was basically on macroeconomics, is that people look at the government, and when the government changed their policies, people form their expectations how the government changed the policies. And that led to huge revolution in macroeconomics. So that was the key assumption was rational expectation relative to adaptive expectation. So people are forward-looking, and that has revolutionized not only economic in the academia, but actually in practice. I mean, if you look at what central banks are doing, they're all looking at what people expect to the future based on what they've seen in the past, but trying to formulate what to do in the future. And policy have to take it in consideration if they want to apply what we call optimal policy, meaning low inflation in particular, high output in the macro sense. And also government actions are considered by individuals as people form their expectation what government will do. And that is a key to the way policy affects individuals. My dissertation was about Egyptian farmers who try to form their expectations how the prices of the product will look in the future, and the response to that, based on rational expectation, generated what we call the cobweb model, meaning a cyclical model, which was due to the dynamics of the production process, meaning that if you see a high price, you start produce a lot, but that has an impact on the productivity and may reverse their action in the future, and they take into consideration. And I think it revolutionized way economists are thinking about almost every economic issue in micro and macro. And the professors at Minnesota, not only them, Robert E. Lucas was a leading economist about it, and later also Ed Prescott, who got the Nobel, were also a leading economist to show that expectation, dynamic, and stochastic environment are key to individual decisions, and therefore they are key to optimal policies.
Yes, not many people know that, the main thing about economics is about how people make decisions. So I always like that in the podcast, people, the economists start to reveal it, because many people think that economics is about money and interest rate and do not understand the basic is actually the decision making. So that's
and you're right. The key, how people make decisions, and the key new aspect that came from Minnesota and others was the fact that we are living in a dynamic stochastic environment, and people form their expectation on the future, which determine what they do in the present.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a key insight that did not exist as a leading in the leading framework of thinking in economics before the 70s.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And you chose your path to be an academic, but you're also very involved in policymaking. So I thought you might share with our audience how exactly it looks to be an academic that also influence policy. How does it look exactly, like in your day-to-day work?
Well, I reached the position of being what we call a policymaker is when I was appointed as a deputy governor of the Bank of Israel. I started in July 2006, and the first thing that happens to you when you come to the Bank of Israel, you start meeting the people in the different departments and consider what type of decisions you have to make. And I quickly learned that things that I have learned while I was an economist in academia has a lot of knowledge that can affect my understanding of what actually the Bank of Israel is doing. Of course, the key decision that the governor at that time has to make was the decision on monetary policy. And as I say, the monetary policy has changed quite significantly during the years, and economists from the academia become leading policymakers all over the world. I mean, at that time, Ben Bernanke was a professor which I knew, and I knew his writing and so forth. Professor Fisher was from the academia, and he has been involved in policy before, and others, Professor Larry Summers, and also in central banks, there were a lot of academic people that I knew that were heavily involved in actual policy. And therefore, going to the Bank of Israel and involved in the main policy making in the Bank of Israel I felt very comfortable because I knew the general framework of thinking, etc. What you learn is that to do policy in practice, what you have learned in academia give you a framework of thinking, but reality is more complicated, and you don't use the models exactly what they do, but they give you a framework of making decision making and different considerations. So actually, I felt very comfortable on try to weight the different aspect of life, and also to understand in what sense we in academia really understand a particular topic, or we have a vague understanding, and therefore you have to use intuition, common sense, and reading both previous policymakers, current policymakers, and academic papers to formulate your view on each particular question that came along the way.
And how does it interact in the sense that, in our models, we have very clean, setting that whenever we want, we make assumptions, this doesn't happen, this does happen. And then in real life, all of a sudden, everything is happening and you cannot assume away anything.
Well, it's true. As I said, you have to formulate a bit of intuition. You have to look at the models and to see the models are guidance. They give you direction. For example, in monetary policy, we learned that interest rate decisions are influenced mainly from two main variables. One is the actual inflation relative to what you think should be the long-run inflation. And the second is how much unemployment, or if you want, output gap, which means output gap is large, meaning that you are producing much less than what you could produce, which is like unemployment is large. And both indicators, the difference between actual inflation to target inflation, and we formulate the idea of target inflation of 2% as a goal that provides stability, and you can understand how it provides stability to the economy. And basically, the interest rate has to go up if inflation is much higher, like today, than the target. And it certainly has to go up if unemployment is very low and the output gap is what we call very close to zero. It's become more complicated if inflation is high, but unemployment is high as well. So what do? So there are the theories that provide you some numbers on the direction, but then you have also your intuition about the overall. The other thing which was very important about the policy was that both the public and you should understand that the decision you make today affect the economy over time in the future. So you have to be forward-looking in the prediction. So you have to do forecasting. In forecasting, we use different methods. We use econometric methods. And I grew up as an econometrician in Minnesota. I knew a lot about econometrics. I knew a lot about data. I knew the strengths of econometrics, but I also knew the weaknesses of econometrics. And therefore, I could use my common sense how to use the results from the econometric models such that we would provide the optimal policies. So overall, when I came to the position of making an interest rate decision and advising the governor on the interest rate decision with a very strong background, both from my academic knowledge, but also from observation reality over time. I also did some consulting in the past. I also was involved in as a director or a head of investment committees in pension funds and other places in the private sector. So my total training when I reach the policy-making position has been, I think, excellent of both sides. The one thing that I didn't know is how to manage, and that's I had to study how to manage people and to understand that actually the human resources is the most important resource that you have next to you. And if you are not cooperating and working well with the human resources around you, then you are losing a lot of ability to reach data, opinion, different views, etc. So I start to develop my knowledge of how to manage the people around me such that both of us would be happy and we'd be willing to provide the information to make best decisions. So that was a learning process.
Yeah, because I think the life of academic is very individual normally.
Yeah, we are in front of the computers, we invent our problems, and we try to write something to convince other people that our solutions are sensible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm going to go back later to this whole idea of, the policy advice. But I want to also talk with you about, actually, when you came back to academia, I think you did something very unique, at least here in Israel. I think there are similar things abroad, but you started Aaron Institute, which is a combination of both academia and government together. So maybe tell us a little bit about about this idea, this vision, and it's also its practice.
Well, the one thing that happened to me when I was deputy governor is I realized how important is the knowledge accumulated both in academic research, but also in a semi-academic research like the OECD, the economists at the OECD who get academic research, but they try to use implementing policy, or the IMF who is doing equivalent, or the World Bank, or actually the professional economists in governments. And in Israel, my main observation was that the quality of advisory research does not really combine optimally the frontier knowledge in academia and in institutions that try to develop policies that would enhance growth and reduce poverty. And And therefore, when I left the Bank of Israel, one of my main passion was to establish an institute of that form. And coming to, at that time, IDC, and now Reichman University, it was a great opportunity because the culture here at the Reichman University is that important part of academic contribution to the society is bring leadership in implementing the frontier knowledge of your field into the public life and into the government decision making. And therefore, I did two things. First, I changed the program in the economic, and I focus, as you know, Yael, that what is really important is really how to use the basic idea that you learn in the theory of micro, macro, and econometrics into policy. And we taught the student the full year, the third year, how policy implementation can be done based on what we learned in the years before. And then the second step was to establish an institute that bring top people who had a PhD, who learn a lot on using academic knowledge and reading what other countries are doing to implement it in Israel. And that was the idea of Aaron Institute. And I was lucky to meet Shlomo Dovrat, who is very involved in venture capital in general, but also in thinking and implementing economic policy. He was heading an important committee on revising the education system in Israel. I was actually involved a lot in employment direction policy, besides the Bank of Israel monetary policy. And my involvement in employment policy was, I think, quite successful when I was a deputy governor. And I wanted to continue this. And really, that's to influence the high professionals in the government departments, the different departments, the different places. And also very important is the Ministry of Finance, because the way policy is working is that the departments and the finance ministry formulate an agenda that bring into the government decision together. It's very hard to do it without support of the department who has to implement it, and the finance ministry who has to finance in the budget. And then I was decided that bring up the Aaron Institute is really to try to influence policy. And our main achievement has been that in few areas, we succeed to develop new reform in the agreement with the finance ministry and the department and the Bank of Israel and other people on direction to go. It was in employment, in technical training, in investment in infrastructure, etc. And our institute is based on donations of, and we are non-profit, and therefore we can bring our knowledge, our thinking in a very objective way based on the main achievement of economic analysis of the recent years.
And who are the people who work there? You have the PhDs, but you also have not work there, but what I want you to maybe describe how you interact, because you do these round tables and then you have the people who are the thinkers, the researchers, with the people from the government, everybody together. So can you tell us a little bit?
What you know, this is another thing that we discussed before, is that you have to understand that when you come to a problem, there are different aspects. For example, let's take the case of employment. There are issues that we understand in employment, but there are issues that people are doing policy in practice that coming from technical issues. There are issues related to restrictions from regulations, there are restrictions from different laws. There is also sometimes a psychological aspect of the decisions, and there are also the view coming from the industry and from the practical aspect of the government. So when we come with a suggestion of a reform, I always thought that before you write your final recommendation, it will be a good idea to bring your recommendation and your analysis in front of a diverse audience, including in particular policymakers, and get the responses. If this is feasible, if this is really advisable, or this other aspect that we missed. And that is the roundtable that we organize. And we try to get really the views of different people from all over and reshape our recommendation. Also, the roundtable is a way to discuss it with the professional at the government, as I said. And then we write the papers and we try to bring it into practice. The people who are doing it, it's mainly researchers or senior researchers at the institute who are recent PhDs from universities here in Israel, and they work hard with research assistants, which are master students or PhD students in Israel, and together we try to formulate methods to analyze the data and to focus on what are the main reforms that can really lead Israel to grow faster and to be less level of poverty, which is accessible in Israel in comparison to the world. We have a lot of people on what we call the lower part of the income distribution.
Mm-hmm. I can tell you, so now I will use this. I was present in your recent roundtable about the housing prices, and you know that housing prices in Israel is one of the leading problems among many others. And one of the things you basically presented is that a lot of things that cause these problems are, first, the fact that you have lack of supply and more demand than supply. And the thing that sort of limit the supply is actually government regulations that may be changed. And if they would be changed, it would enhance supply. So this is on one thing that happens. And on the other hand, I was, as a listener, I had several problems. First, the fact that we have now inflation means that we increase interest rate. So that's something that, will even probably make it harder to people to purchase homes. And basically, what would you, knowing all these things, and in addition to that, even then at the round table, one of the people said that one of the problems in Israel is the government instability. And today we know that we are again, we have elections soon. So how do you think about what would be the optimal policy in this setting? It's so complex.
Well, there are several aspects in the housing. I think the most important that you mentioned is what's going on in Israel is the population is growing fast, much faster than all advanced countries. I mean, we are growing on 1.7, almost 2% number of households are formulated every year. And therefore, we have to build up units, the apartments or family units to fit the demand. And if we don't produce as many as the increase in population, then the demand is higher than the supply. And what we know from economics is prices are going up, and who suffers are the distribution, are the people who have a low income, because the cost of housing become larger and larger share of the total expenditures. What we see in the data, when you look over the long run from the 70s to today, and you can see that house price or an apartment price, take in consideration that actually the quality of the average apartment has increasing. There are more rooms, there is more space. On average, people demand more because their income is higher. Average income is growing almost 2% a year as well. So what we need is we have to produce more apartments in a higher quality. But what happened today is those average apartment price is 30% higher than what would have been the trend of the income per capita relative to what we were in the 70s and the 80s. And therefore, and when you look at the last 10 years, the market generated almost every year 10,000 units less than the number of new households joined the economy. So that is the main problem, and the government hasn't done enough to make sure that the system will generate enough apartments. And we point out the reason, and you were right, the bureaucracy is terrible. Planning is being behind. Planning is important because you cannot build wherever you want. You need a planning. The municipalities, and in particular the large municipalities like Jerusalem, Haifa, and Tel Aviv area, they have income to provide services to their the household who live there. Their income comes more from taxes on real estate of business than taxes on residents. So adding another additional residents make it non-profitable, and they try to limit this number. And there is no uniform forces of the government to make sure that the number of units built by each municipality fit the aggregate demand. And that's, I think, is the main problem. Now the Ministry of Finance, the first time, made some kind of an offer how to incentivize the municipality to increase the number of units they do. They do it in a lot back problems. We actually think that they should put targets, and they need to put targets of unit at least at the level of what we call Mahoz, which is a large area. It's more than a county. It's a large area. Israel is divided to six areas. You know, like north, the south, the center, and then the Dan area and Jerusalem. And they really have to put targets on the committees who are making the decisions of approving. Another thing which is very problematic in Israel is that once you approve a unit to be built, it takes the contractor almost a year, sometimes even more than a year, to get the permit to start building, because the municipalities have to complete the sewage, have to complete the schools, have to complete all the other services. So that's a huge bureaucratic problem. And then they have to start building, and it takes more than 2 years to finish. So in fact, every government decision that is made today takes about 3 years until we get the unit built. And until the unit built, we cannot have the family to occupy it. So the family has a demand for either living with their parents or living renting, etc. So our main advice is that the government should really focus on how to incentivize that there will be increase a lot of units to be built all over the country, because the population is really diverse. Some people want to live in the north, some people in the south, some people in the center. It depends on where your family live, it depends on your job, it depends on many other aspects. And therefore, I think the government is actually failed to develop a strategy which fit the special aspect of Israel to reduce the prices to what I call normal prices, meaning prices that the expenses of the family for housing would be as it used to be 30, 40 years ago.
So now the last problem is that, okay, now we want to fight inflation and we're going to increase the interest rate. So the people who need housing, they would just have to pay more.
And that's even another problem on the cost of housing is the interest rate. Well, it's true that the interest rate was very low. And when the interest rate is very low, the demand is high. So that was another cause for the prices to go up. So there is the cost of housing is moving between the interest. So when the interest rate goes up, then the price of housing going down. So the cost of just from the interest rate, the cost of actually spending on housing is kind of balanced when you change the interest rate. What really caused the average price to be much higher is not the interest rate, is how many units you build relative to how many families are household are added to the economy. And the fact that we were in the last 15 years, we were way behind in terms of unit built relative to unit join the economy, that is the main cause for the very high cost of living. And the cost of living is very, very high, mainly because of housing is very expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I hope that our next election would be more stable than at least provide government.
Well, it's not enough that the election would be stable, is that the government will start doing their job. And to do the job, they have to understand the real estate market and what are the real failures there. And unfortunately, since 2009, when prices were going up, there was a stable government for 12 years. And they basically did nothing.
Mm-hmm. So we need to hope for a stable government and a productive government that would
That's true, because in the last year, it's not clear whether it was a government action or not. The number of permits reached the highest and actually very, very good number, about 80,000. And the number of new starting units this year in the last year has been reaching the level of 70,000. Both, if they would continue on that level for the next 5-6 years, then housing prices will stabilize and will return to the normal price within 10 years. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I'm not sure that the governments now in the transition, or even the government in the future, would be able to make so many units to start and so many units to be approved as in permits. But that's we shall see.
Yes, well, I think what you're doing in our institute is very, very important to educate, the government and others, about what need to be done, because many people just don't know it at all.
Yeah.
Excellent. So I think we're reaching to the end of almost our discussion. So I think I'm going to go back to education, because we are talking a lot about education in this podcast. What do you think would be the future of education? What do you think now? Today we have so many changes. We have the hybrid education, and how do you see the education in 10 years from now?
Well, first of all, I have to say that education, which we call in economics human capital, is probably the most important asset that individuals bring for their life in general, certainly for their potential income as earners and workers and support of their family. So therefore, the role of education in life has been growing in the last 150 years. And I think it will be as important and more important in the coming years, because innovations and new methods, etc., make our world much more complicated. And without high quality education of understanding and being able to learn new things, it's not the education. The most important part of education is to teach you how to teach yourself and learn and read and understand the environment that related to your daily life as an individual, as well as to daily life as a worker in your workplace. So the importance of education would certainly become and continue to be the most important aspect of every society. And therefore, I would just say that therefore it is extremely important to improve our education system throughout life. You know, from first day to teach the mothers how to take care of their kids, to teach the father how to take care of their kids together. Then the early childhood is a very influential, in particular, and the household is a very influential on the children, on the young children, etc. In providing them what we say the culture of education, and the culture and the knowledge how important is education, and then also to develop the schools, the formal schools, the daycares, and the formal school, to provide them what we call the basic knowledge, which, by the way, the OECD measure by the PISA, so it's a lot of what we call basic knowledge of behavior. And some of this is not the school, you know, like in Israel, the youth movements are extremely important. They are complement to what you do in the family and what you do in the school, because it enables you by yourself to develop your ability to deal with conflict and questions in general, and how to work in teams. And that's also very important, and how to compromise is very important. Actually, we learn that people who are doing sport activities, which you learn sometimes how to take, you're losing a game, and how to deal with both problems of success and problem of failure. But then later on is also the academic world is extremely important. And then also there are some people who don't go to academia, the vocational training, to people who have tried to learn things which are more non-cognitive abilities, but also cognitive abilities, but being able to very successful in their comparative advantage. That's another thing that we learn in economics. Each individual has his own comparative advantage, and you want to strengthen his comparative advantage in whether he has good hands or whether he has good thinking, etc. What he feels is most exciting him. And therefore, I think the process of education should be a process of long life learning, and long life learning because things are improving. So I would say that the most important for me, like for example, a student in economics, is to provide them basic knowledge on economic thinking, and think as an economist, and then use this thinking as an economist to analyze issues and questions that you will deal in your work and in your personal decision throughout your life. And that's, I think, is the most challenge of education overall, and actually to provide the basic for the opportunity to each individual, no matter the income and the household he came from, that how he can optimize his potential. That's very complicated. That's the most complicated part of the education system.
Yes, that's the the goal, and the question is, of course, how we can achieve it. Last question about economics education is, in economics we teach a lot of models that you studied as an undergrad, I studied as an undergrad, our students today studied as an undergrad, and the question is, do you think it will ever change, or like the basic models would always stay and then some new things would arrive? What do you think?
Well, we always, I think the first thing is that economics has developed in the last, well, we say that Adam Smith was the founder of economics with the invisible hand about demand and supply, etc. What we have done in the last, I would say, 70, 80 years is formalize economics in a more, in a very organized way that you try to understand the question, you make some assumptions, basic assumptions that provide you the ability to analyze the question in a coherent way that can be repeated and rethinking by other people. And because what is important in a model, it's like in any model, is that the model provides you like a toy to analyze a question. And the toy could be adjusted. So it can take to see the robustness of the answer to the question with respect to certain assumptions and with respect to certain things that you see in the data. And I think the framework that has been developed in economics of actually making the things in terms of a rigorous framework is very useful, has improved very, very useful to develop our thinking on complicated issues in reality. Reality is not a model, and the reality is much more complicated than the model. The question is to what extent the model enable you to understand reality in a better way. And I believe that economics as a field has proved over time to be a very useful way of thinking about social issues. And in particular, not only thinking, but providing relatively robust answers on what are the optimal policies. And that, I think, is the most important. The most important is that economics provided a framework that enable you to find robust result of regarding policies that are always, like we discuss about education. Should we study more mathematics or more social behavior? Should we study more ideology and history and less other things? I think economics provide a different way of looking on the, what we say, the right combination of how to educate people, to give them the ability to, what we say, maximize their potential in life. And in this sense, I think economics has been proved as a very useful field of study. And I would say that overall, it has a big impact on almost all social sciences, the economic way of thinking.
Yeah, I think it has a big impact on the world in general, because you use it in the big questions. At the end of the day, it's very, very useful, as you said. Okay, I think we got a really fantastic overview of academia and policy and education. And I want to thank you so much for your time. And
okay. Yes. Thank you, Yael, and I hope it was useful to learn from my experience.
I'm sure it is, and I'm looking forward to share it with our students and listeners. And I'm going to also take the opportunity to say that if you are listening to us and you find this thing fascinating as we do, and you want to study economics or business and economics, then we at Reichman University have a fantastic program, and you're invited to explore it on the websites and everything. And we are in the Future Economist. And thank you so much, Professor Zvi Eckstein, for being with us.